very nice to have you as a friend. Well, walking in that brisk air got my sinuses stirred up, so I hope I can sniffle through everything. I'm just really glad to be able to be on the program again this year. I think it's one of the highlights of my year to be able to be a part of this lectureship program. I believe, and several people away from this area have said that we have one of the best lectureships as far as the brotherhood is concerned, because our lecture program is very Bible oriented, and we have men that stick to the subject and cover the ground that is assigned to them, and I think that's very worthwhile for those in attendance, that they can get a real feel for the whole of the chapter or book or whatever verses or passages being covered. And so I'm glad always to be asked to be on the program. Job is a man whose story, of course, is familiar to, I'm sure, about everybody in this audience and to most Bible students. Verse 1 begins, "There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, and one that feared God and shunned evil." I think that it's worth pointing out that the Bible, the book begins by saying, "There was a man." Critics say that Job was a fictitious character, that his book is just a book of fiction. It is a book written to show people how to suffer or to teach them about suffering. But I think that we need to accept the first four words, "There was a man." I believe that Job was a real person, that he is a real Bible entity, and one that was flesh and blood. He had a family, he had wealth, he had honor and respect. All the people that knew him respected him and looked to him for help and assistance. Now, the context of the book, in my opinion, is set in the patriarchal era. I believe that Job lived in the time between Noah and Abraham. And there are several reasons for that, but looking at the context of the book and the age of Job that is pointed out, he was already a man of old age. He had already acquired a large family, great herds and flocks. He was a man of wealth and honor and prestige. And then at the close of the book, the Bible says that Job lived 140 more years after that. And so I believe that we could very easily simply add 140 and 140 together and come up with about the proper age for Job. That would place him then in the time of the patriarchs, when men lived to an old age. Noah lived 950 years. Abraham lived 175 years. If Job lived after his ordeal 140 years and was already a man of age and wisdom, then I believe that he was older than Abraham, and thus is in the patriarchal age. When you think, too, that the book of Job does not talk about the law of Moses, it doesn't talk about a priesthood, an Aaronic priesthood, or anything that has to do with the nation that would be the Hebrew nation. And so I think that I'm safe in that conclusion. And most conservative writers that I read after have come to that conclusion as well. Job is mentioned, of course, in other Bible books. Several have pointed out that he is in the book of James. You remember the patience of Job. But Ezekiel, the prophet, also holds up Job as a person of great character, moral character. And in chapter 14, he is laying out the sins of Israel, and he makes this observation. Even if these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they would deliver only themselves by their righteousness, says the Lord God. Ezekiel 14:14. Then in that same chapter, 6 verses later, he repeats nearly word for word what he had said. Even though Noah, Daniel, and Job were in it, as I live, says the Lord God, they would deliver neither son nor daughter. They would deliver only themselves by their righteousness. I take a side light here to simply point out something from this passage in Ezekiel. I believe that these verses substantiate the Bible doctrine that all persons are accountable to God for their sins, that every soul is going to answer to God in the judgment. And Ecclesiastes, the close of Ecclesiastes, the writer suggests that the judgment that is coming will be for those who have, let's see. Got off, Andy. Thinking too far ahead. Well, 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10. That we are going to stand before God and give an account of ourselves to God, whether it be good or evil, and Ecclesiastes 12, 13, and 14 says the same thing. But a lot of people think that they can get to heaven riding on the coattails of relatives, mothers, fathers, or some other great person that might be in their family, a Christian person. But Ezekiel tells us that that's not the case. That every person is accountable as an individual. That we are not going to go to heaven as a group, but rather as an individual person. The doctrine of Calvinistic Protestantism and Augustinian Catholicism both teach that sin is inherited, that we inherit Adam's sin. But and they teach that people are born totally depraved. Brother Roy Hearn used to tell us in school that evil men and seducers will wax worse and worse. They shall deceive and be deceived. But if evil seducers wax worse and worse and are born totally depraved, Brother Hearn said that they must have been teetotally depraved. And so if you're born depraved, you can't get any worse than that. But one of their preachers has said in a tract that I have in my files that there will be babies in hell not a span long. Well, that's a wicked and cruel and vicious doctrine. And so we come back to Ezekiel. Ezekiel 18 says, "The soul that sinneth, it shall die. The son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, nor the father the iniquity of the son. The soul that sinneth, it shall die." And so I think that it's worth looking at Job's name in another text that helps us to see that lesson. My task this afternoon is to give an exposition of sorts of chapter 29. And the title of my lesson fits the chapter very well. When life is not as it used to be. And so this is a book in which Job is looking back, that he is reminiscing. One writer called it a mini autobiography of the life of Job. Mr. Roy Zuck, in his commentary, says the last three chapters of Job's speech, which would be 29, 30, and 31, he says is a concluding summary of the case as if he were in court. And several of our speakers have talked about this aspect of the book of Job. In chapter 29, he revealed his past blessings. And then in chapter 30, he bemoaned his present miseries. And then the last chapter, 31, he pronounced an oath of innocence. And if you read those carefully, chapter 30 and 31, I believe, have already been talked about. But if you read those three chapters together, I think you'll see that that's a good way of concluding the last speeches of Job. But Job begins by saying, in chapter 29, Job further continued his discourse. Now that occurs in an earlier chapter as well. I think that is simply saying that Zophar or Bildad or Eliphaz has ceased their speech, and Job has taken up their argument and answered it, and now he is giving pause to see if they want to continue their argument against him. And so when they don't speak up, then Job goes on with his discourse. Now, as we begin our study, we find that Job has perhaps gotten used to the idea of his misery. You know, when tragedy first befalls us, I think that we do go into a state of shock in several different ways. And it takes us a while to come to the conclusion that this is the way that my life is now, and I am going to have to bear up under it. If any of us have had a long enduring illness, or some surgery that has laid us low and it takes weeks and months to recuperate, perhaps even a year or two or more, then the initial shock of what has happened to us, we get used to the idea that I'm going to be this way at least for a while, and maybe things will get better. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And so he finds himself reflecting on his condition and reminiscing of better times. Now, Solomon warned of the futility of looking back. Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 10. But reminiscing is the feature, actually, of this chapter. And Job is looking back to the time when his health was good, when prosperity was being enjoyed, his family, all were happy. And chapter 1 presents the children as gathering on the day of one of those children. And so most commentators think that this was probably a birthday when all of the children were gathered together celebrating that birthday when that terrible wind destroyed them. And so Job finds himself thinking of these things when he found favor in the eyes of God. Reminiscence, in Job's case, is more than just nostalgia. Reminiscence, I believe, is a right or a privilege of an older person. I don't like to see preachers 20 years old get up and say, I remember back when. It just don't have any ring to it. But when an older person, a person that does have some age and experience behind him, would say, I remember, or I'm thinking back to a certain time or event, then it means something. And Job is of an age where he can do that. It's the privilege and the length of years and experience is good and bad, by the way, that make reminiscence profitable to us. And I would think that by this time in the account of Job's life, that months have passed. There's 2 or 3 times in the book where it talks about months having passed. And so the book of Job perhaps does not take a long time to develop, not years at all, but rather these are things that happened in a very quick time, and now months have passed, and Job at this point is looking back on what he once was and what he once had. And maybe he's even wondering, have all of these calamities come on me in such a short period of time? Why, a person can look back and say, why, a year ago I was able to do this and I was doing that. And now I am here, I'm sitting on an ash heap with a broken piece of pottery and scraping my sores. And nobody is befriending me. Nobody is coming around. Everything that Job has and had has been taken away from him. The friends that come to call, he says, you are miserable comforters. You ever have anybody come to the hospital and when you're really sick, or into your room to visit you, and they just make you worse than ever? That's the way Job's friends were. They made Job feel worse by their arguing, by their jabs at Job, and some of them were pretty cruel. And so he says, you're physicians with no cure. You're miserable comforters. Well, we don't want to be miserable comforters. Now, in this reminiscing that we see in this chapter, Job is going to establish his case for innocence. That is, at least innocence of the charges that his friends have leveled against him. In a grateful manner, Job acknowledges that God, not his own wisdom and shrewdness, had been the source of his wealth. Job never let his pride lead him to make the claim that he had been the genius behind his success, Hartley says in his commentary. But look at what has happened to Job. Wave after wave of trouble has overwhelmed him. It's like being on a small ship in a stormy sea, and the waves just keep rolling over you and over you and over you, and surely you're going to sink. Job has no pause between the waves of his affliction, Davidson says. No time to recover from one before another overwhelms him. He says, if he fears a fear, there is a fear. Strauss says the intensity of Job's condition is emphasized by the words that he is surrounded by trouble, drowned by trouble. Agitation and abuse just keep coming and coming and coming, on and on and on, repeatedly. How much can a body take? How much can the soul take? Brother W.T. Hamilton observed, surely no one ever expressed a desire for the good old days with more emotion than Job did. And no one ever had a right to long for the past more than he did, because no one ever had a sharper contrast between the then and now as he. We think of the heartache of Job as he remembers and speaks of the ripeness of my days. The other translation calls it the prime of life, the autumn of my years. Now, the autumn of my years is not talking about his old age as such, but it is simply when he is in his prime, when he is reaping the benefits and the blessings of the things that have transpired before in his life. And he longs for that time when he again will have that sort of thing. He remembers his former days when God preserved him and watched over him, when the eye of the Almighty was over him. And he says, when the friendship of God was upon my tent, and by his light I walked through the darkness, when his lamp shined upon my head. Job is in his reminiscence basking in the sunlight, the divine sunlight of God's grace and love toward him. And he does not understand what has happened, but he longs for that time. I'm sure that these kind of things come to us when we have our own tragedies and heartaches in life. Things have changed for Job. It's now a time of darkness and a time of great crisis, a time of trial, a time of testing, but it is a time of intense suffering and pain as well. And he says that he longed for the day when the Almighty was yet with me. I think that we can almost hear Job sobbing and see the tears gushing from his eyes when he said that he longed for the time when my children were still with me. I have 4 children and 8 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild. And I've heard of families that lose a child, maybe friends that lose a child. I put myself in their place. And I say, what would I do if that was my case? Now, I know that some of you in this audience have lost children. You have had to bear that sad cross. And so I think that Job weeps when he thinks about his children. Those children, all 10 of them, are gone. They're taken away just like the dust in the wind. His wife has forsaken him. His friends are useless to him. And so Job really, truly feels alone in this world because he does not seem to be getting any comfort, no word from God as to why all of this has happened. He remembers the prosperity he once enjoyed and speaks of the time when I washed my steps with butter. What a figure of speech. And the rock poured out rivers of oil. I would think that a person whose steps are washed with butter or cream. That sounds like pretty much luxury to me. The rock from which the oil came was either the rocky soil, Haley says, where the olive trees grew, or perhaps it's speaking of the rock press where the olive oil was pressed out. But olive oil was a very precious commodity in these days, and they used it for cooking, they used it for light, they used it for medicinal purposes to mollify wounds or sores. And you might think of Job. He's sitting there scraping his skin with a broken piece of pottery, and he doesn't have any oil to mollify and soften his skin. In chapter 19, Job describes his wretchedness as that of an outcast. He's separated from all classes of society. Let's turn back and read just a few of those verses. Chapter 19, verses 13 through 19. He hath put my brethren far from me, and mine acquaintances are wholly estranged from me. I'm reading from the American Standard Version. My kinsfolk have failed, all my familiar friends have forgotten me. They that dwell in my house and my maids count me as a stranger. I am an alien in their sight. I call to my servant, and he gives me no answer, though I entreat him with my mouth. My breath is strange to my wife, and my supplication to the children of my own mother, that would be his brothers and sisters, he doesn't get any response from them. Even young children despise me. If I arise, they speak against me, and all my familiar friends abhor me, and they whom I loved are turned against me. Job is friendless as far as he is concerned. The scriptures emphasize to the Christian that suffering and hardship are a natural part of living. Romans 11:22, behold the goodness and severity of God, I think has a couple applications. Maybe this application is out of context, but when the Christian is tried, when he is tested, when he is tempted, as James points out in James chapter 1, blessed is the man that endures temptation when he is tried. And so we have temptation, we have trials and testing in life. And so Job can't account for why he is having this difficulty. Jesus in the Beatitudes describes suffering and trials and tribulations for his saints. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. I believe that there especially it's religious persecution that is being given. And James says, or rather Paul says, all in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution, trials. Job remembered his lost position of leadership in verses 7 through 10. He thinks of his past preeminence and prominence among his peers. There are 5 classes of spokesmen in the Old Testament: the lawgiver Moses, the priests, the prophets, and the psalmists, and the wise men at the gate. Job was one of these men at the gate. The voice of, in verse 8, he begins, verse 7. When I went forth to the gate unto the city, when I prepared my seat in the street, The young men saw me and hid themselves. The aged rose up and stood. The princes refrained from talking and laid their hand on their mouth. The voice of the nobles was hushed, and their tongue cleaved to the roof of their mouth. When the ear heard me, then it blessed me. And when the eye saw me, it gave witness to me. I believe that Job is saying here that he was one of those wise men with age and wisdom who would come to the gates of the city or a village, community, and hear the cases of people, neighbors against neighbor, or perhaps simply a problem that they need some counsel or advice about. And Job is one of those kind of men. Wisdom is said to utter her voice in the streets, in the opening of the gates, at the entry of the city, at the coming in of the doors. Proverbs 1 and verse 20. And so Job here speaks of himself as a civil magistrate, as a judge upon the bench, who had a seat or a throne erected in a prominent place where people could congregate to him, and he would hear their difficulty and then give them advice or even see to justice being done for them. Under the law of Moses, when parents had a disobedient child, they were to bring him out unto the elders of his city and unto the gate of his place. And then corrective judgment would be given against them. Deuteronomy chapter 21 and verse 19. The book of Ruth, in the people of Bethlehem had gathered at the city gate with the elders of the city to witness the legality of Boaz's acquiring of the property of Elimelech, which included Naomi and Ruth. And so the matter of that property settlement was decided there in the gate. The reaction of the people to Job's city when he appeared among them was one of great honor and respect. The young men saw me and hid themselves. Perhaps it's simply because that young men are often brash with their words and too quick to speak, and maybe they had seen or Job had leveled the glare of his eye against them at some point, or even may have answered them sharply to correct something that they were doing. And so the young. But then the old men had great respect as well. The aged, when Job came, the aged arose and stood. And so these men who are wise in their own merit rose up and honored him who is greater than they. They recognized the greatness of Job, and even the aged men stood for him. Of the princes and nobles, Matthew Henry says, those that suspected their own judgment were satisfied in his, and admired with what dexterity he split the hair and untied the knots which puzzled them, and which they knew not how to answer. When the princes and nobles wrangled among themselves, all agreed to refer the matters in dispute to Job and to abide by his judgment. Such was the august personage of Job among the citizens. Job's benevolence. I'm going to have to rush here, but Job says, I delivered the poor that cried, the fatherless also that had none to help him. The blessing of him that was ready to perish came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing with joy. I was eyes to the blind, feet was I to the lame. I was a father to the needy, and the cause of him that I knew not I searched out. Remember the arguments of Job's friends. They said, Job, you haven't taken care of any widows. You have not remembered the poor. You have not been a guide to the blind or feet help the lame at all. But Job is answering that. And this is his summation, if you will, destroying the charges that they have made against him. Job says, I have done what you say that I did not do. You'll see that after these 3 chapters, 29, 30, and 31, his friends have nothing more to say. And so Job has made his case and is making his case for being a benevolent and good man. Verse 16, he says, I was father to the needy, and the cause of him that I knew not I searched out. And I broke the jaws of the unrighteous and plucked the prey out of his teeth. The ESV says that he broke the fangs of them. The one translation renders it, well, the footnote in the ASV says great teeth. He broke their great teeth, fangs. And so these vicious people that abused the poor, Job was not just a judge that heard their cry, but he pursued the case in such a way that he would go to them and defend them and get justice for them. Well, that's the kind of judges that we need now. We have a lot of worthless lawyers and judges. Now, we have a lot of good ones. But I'll tell you what, a lawyer that defends a criminal, and I don't know how a man can know that a man is guilty of the crime that he has done, especially a vicious crime of some sort. How can you defend a man like that? A real lawyer and a real judge ought to be able to settle a matter like that pretty quickly. We pamper and pet and glorify criminals, and justice is never done. Job was not that kind of a judge. I will quit soon. But because of his steady pursuit of justice and the favor of God, Job was confident that God was going to take care of him. Verse 18, then I said, I shall die in my nest. In other words, I'll live a long life and then die here at home, a nice, peaceful, and quiet death. I've heard brethren pray, give me a quiet hour in which to die. I think that is what we would all want. But we know that sometimes it does not happen that way. Sometimes we die tragically and suddenly, or after lengthy illness. He said, my root is spread out to the waters, and the dew lieth all night upon my branch. My glory is fresh in me, and my bow is renewed in my hand. Unto me men gave ear and waited, and kept silence for my counsel. After my words they spake not again, and my speech distilled upon them, and they waited for me as for the rain. They opened their mouth wide as for the latter rain. I smiled on them when they had no confidence, and the light of my countenance they cast not down. I chose out their way. We need men today to help young people to choose out their way, to point them in the right direction, get them started on the right path. Fathers need to do that with their children. Grandparents need to do that with their grandchildren. Uncles and aunts and responsible Christian people ought to always be helping the younger choose out their way and to encourage them and smile on them when they don't have confidence. I chose out their way and sat as chief and dwelt as a king in the army, as one that comforts the mourners. Job had done all of this. He was not guilty of the charges that his his so-called friends had leveled against him. And he vindicated himself. Yes, Job made some charges against God that he should not, but God corrected him, and but Job's friends were not right in what they were doing, and God showed them that at the end of the book. I appreciate your listening so well. The marvelous book of Job, there's just so many, many good things to learn from it. I hope that you will read it often. Thank you.